Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Shining Light Video Podcast Show, where I shine a light on my guests and the positivity they're spreading in their communities. Today, my guest joins me from sunny Ohio, where they have 45-mile-per-hour winds blowing some snow their way. Here in the Hudson Valley, we had school cancellations because we had a few centimeters of snow. But that's not what I'm here to talk with you about or what Jeff's here to talk with you about. I'd like to introduce our retired police lieutenant from the LAPD. He served over 33 years. He's a nationally recognized expert in law enforcement, and he's got his new upcoming book on thin ice. It's going to be launching in March of 2025, but you can pre-order his book starting January. All the links will be in the description of this video, but I would like to welcome my guest today, Jeff Weninger. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Well, we got to catch up a little bit, and I shared with our audience just some of the things we caught up about. We've got the weather taken care of. We got you moving from LA to Ohio taken care of. We got the book taken care of. But of course, we're going to talk a lot more about the book. Something that we didn't get to touch, that I didn't talk about yet in terms of your intro, is the work that you're doing with law enforcement today and how that's impacting these communities.
All right. Well, I'm the founder and CEO of Law Enforcement Consultants. And my background, I'm a nationally recognized expert in police application of force. And my company, as well as my employees, we provide expert testimony in civil and criminal cases involving police application of force. But more importantly, what we do is we provide consultation to law enforcement agencies to implement management best practices. And the goal there is to try to reduce liability, enhance operational efficiency, all with the goal of having better outcomes where police actions are more aligned with societal expectations. And what motivates me in this is during my career, the 33 years, I saw the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I can consider myself a truth teller. In order to know and have a vision of where you need to move to improve in the future, you have to be honest about where you've been, and you have to, more importantly, be honest about where you are currently. And that is what I do, and it's through my experiences and my expertise that I'm helping to guide law enforcement to be successful in moving forward in the 21st century.
Mm. I mean, and you have quite a task ahead of you with the things that have happened over the past couple years. Of course, George Floyd being one of the big ones that really shined the light as to what was happening in that space on both ends, on both ends. And so, I guess in terms of the work that you're doing here, um, how are you working with these different departments on this? You said best practices on these best practices. So, shine a light, or let's get behind the curtain here as to what is being done from the police standpoint of what are best practices internally? What do they look like for us?
Well, to give context to your listeners, it's really important to understand law enforcement in the United States.
Yeah.
There's over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and each state grants the police officers their police authority in that particular state. That being said, there is no standard, national standard for law enforcement agencies to abide by. So it's oftentimes incumbent upon the states and individual law enforcement organizations to best manage their police departments. And one of my criticisms of law enforcement would be how insufficient law enforcement agencies are. It's not necessarily we don't outside of the United States, but we don't even look oftentimes outside of our own police agency. When I was at the LAPD, if LAPD didn't come up with the idea, really weren't interested. And we need to break out of that. There's a culture in law enforcement that needs to be broken out of, where we're open to critical thinking, being honest about where we are, identifying the areas that we need to make improvements, and looking at other law enforcement agencies, but not just law enforcement agencies here in the United States, but also those throughout the world, over in Europe, most significantly.
Is there a movement to try to have some sort of national standard for police agencies in the US?
there's been talk, but it's just like everything else. When you talk about the politics of it, you have states have the powers, and the states are the ones that grant the authority. So it's incumbent upon the states to implement the standards for the police officers. And let me give you some insight. The average police academy, the amount of hours you have to be trained before you become a police officer in the United States is 840 hours. To apply for your cosmetology license, you need 1,500 hours. You need nearly twice as many hours to be a cosmetologist than you do to be a police officer, who's going to be confronted with stressful situations where you're going to be making split-second decisions and then being second-guessed. There's a breakdown in what we're prioritizing here,
Mm.
and we need to overcome that obstacle.
So,
And
so when you're consulting with these agencies, is this something that you work on helping them change internally?
well, one of the insight that I have is, unfortunately, the Los Angeles Police Department, back in the late 90s, they had the Rampart gang scandal, and the Department of Justice was investigating the department. And that scandal, we had officers that were committing bank robberies, stealing cocaine out of evidence lockup and selling it on the streets, planting guns to justify shootings while on duty. Some of the most egregious law enforcement corruption you can imagine. So the DOJ implemented a consent decree on the department where you have a judge that's overseeing these mandates where changes and adjustments need to be made in the management best practices of the organization. And I was chosen to be the Rampart officer in charge at Rampart Gang Unit during this period of time. So I have a strong background in the implementation of consent decree management best practices, not only in specialized units, but also in the application of force. I spent over 12 years writing the adjudication for Chief Bratton as well as Chief Charlie Beck with the LAPD in all officer involved shooting and lethal force incidents. That was submitted to the Honorable Board of Police Commissioners, who are the ultimate adjudicators of those cases. And then I went on to be the officer in charge of the detective entity that investigated all officer involved shootings and lethal force incidents. So I have a broad wealth of knowledge on what the best practices are of these critical incidents that most often get law enforcement agencies in trouble, and that society and communities are most critical of law enforcement for.
Mm. I mean, that's really helpful when you're going to all these different agencies and being able to bring that information to them and that experience that you had. The other thing that you brought up was critical thinking, and I'd like to speak a little bit about that too, and how you're able to help these agencies um, think on the spot, not agencies, but really the police officer. Uh, what I've witnessed in terms of what I've seen on video through social media, I'm going to be very clear here as to where I'm getting my information. So what is shared on social media, what I've seen is that what I notice when I see an officer um, doing a stop or having an altercation with a civilian or whatever it is, and it goes out of where it's no longer really kind of policing, but now it's becoming like they're arguing with each other. What I find is that it's because of a lack of critical thinking. It's because for some reason the officer is just following the strict rules and guidelines versus being able to address a situation as a here's what's really happening and how we can kind of work through this or solve it together kind of thing. Maybe empathizing with the person or trying to understand or reasoning. And so my question to you is, before I even ask the question, I understand why that is because there's a protection in place. There is I've gone through this scenario 100 times, and 99 out of 100 times I'm right in the sense that there's a threat, but in this one instance that's caught on camera, it's not a threat. And so I understand that there's a background that comes, a jadedness that comes with it. So my question is how do you help these officers who have this experience, who have to follow these guidelines? How do you help them think critically in these types of situations?
Well, it all begins with training. But with training, it's all about education. And in my forthcoming book, On Thin Ice, I talk about education and how significantly important education is, not only in the people that you choose to hire, but throughout your career, that you're continuing with your educational goals, and that the organization actually facilitate and encourage you to do so. And I'll give you some insight why I say this. There was a study that was done here in the United States. It took two medium-sized law enforcement agencies, and they compared officers that had high school educations versus those who had 4-year degrees, university degrees or higher. And what they did was they compared the number of citizen contacts, which would be how many times are they detaining, conducting an investigative stop, okay? How many times did they search those particular individuals that they had detained? And then they looked at their use of force history as well as their complaint history. And probably not surprising to you, Michael, is that there wasn't a difference between those two groups, whether you had a high school education or a 4-year degree or higher education, in regards to the amount of contacts that you had and the number of searches that you conducted. However, what was significant was the number of use of force incidents. Those with 4-year degrees or higher had significantly lower use of force incidents, as well as personnel complaints. So what does this tell you? Education provides you the ability to have it's critical thinking. It's really executive functioning, where you're talking about empathy, critical thinking, self-awareness, creative problem solving. You're objective. You're open-minded to different ways of handling things. And then why is this important? Here in the United States, upwards of 36% of officer-involved shootings involve somebody that's suffering from a mental health crisis. And that's significant, because all too often we see officers here in the United States show up in mass, in uniform, with multiple guns drawn, with a beanbag gun drawn, with taser with the red dot on the individual. They may be holding a knife, and they're just yelling, "Drop the knife, drop the knife, drop the knife." Well, Michael, you and I and all of your listeners know that that's not going to end well. You're escalating the situation when in your thought, you're believing you're de-escalating it and you're utilizing all these different tools that you have. But we're not very self-aware of how our presence and our actions as police officers here in this country impact those in which we're trying to get voluntary compliance from through verbalization, most significantly when they're suffering from a mental health crisis. And I was just over in Europe. I came back on Sunday night, and I was interviewing officers in London with the Metropolitan London Police Department. Why them? They don't carry guns, but they have to confront these people that have mental health crisis, that are armed with something other than a gun, knife, a bat, hatchet, whatever it may be. And if they don't have the tool of lethal force readily available to them. And it was interesting talking to them, and their whole mindset is very different. So they train much differently than we do. And they have a much more empathetic, calm, and reserved approach to addressing this situation. I would be critical of American law enforcement, wherein they're hyper vigilant on the use of force to resolve situations, where over in London they're not. And it's surprising. The argument you would find here would be, well, if you don't use your gun or whatever, you're exposing yourself to a higher risk of being injured. The data does not come out in favor of that. The data is that officers in London have fewer officers that are injured than when they use lethal force scenarios here in the United States. So it's effective and it works. But are we trying to learn from them? We're not, when we should be.
So in terms of your consulting work, is this what you bring to the table? Is that you're helping these different agencies see, like what you said, what they do in London, understand the data in terms of education, and be able to, and this is when we're going back to that question of best practices. This is where we're able to start kind of formulating what's the best practice for your agency in your state.
Right, because no two agencies are exactly the same.
Right.
But there's principles that you want to apply when you're making the decisions on how you're going to move forward and best managing your organization based on the type of community in which you're providing service to and the funding that you actually have. All those sorts of things have to be considered. And I'll give you another example. Significantly, I'm a single father of a 13-year-old boy, and I have concerns just like any other parent, my son's safety while in school, because we have such an elevated incidence of officer or shootings in schools. And many people intuitively believe that the answer to that is school resource officers. Well, if you look at the empirical evidence, that's not the case. 3 times as many people are killed or injured when a school resource officer is present during a school shooting than when they're not. That's the data. So if you're thinking that that's the solution, it's not. Do they provide some benefit? Of course, but they do not prevent or mitigate, and then actually, arguably, they escalate the criticalness of the situation as far as how many people are injured or killed in those circumstances when they're present. And I know it's counterintuitive, but that's the reality. And law enforcement has to accept these realities and turn towards academia and look at what the empirical evidence shows and demonstrates, and don't engage in activities that aren't supported by the data are going to be effective.
Mm. How do you see your work being able to, I guess, how do you see yourself being able to expand your work in the culture that we're in today? The reason for my question is I see you having a huge hurdle in front of you with what we see ready and available to us from the media. So I'm just curious on how you see you being able to make a change in all of these different agencies.
Well, it starts with you have to look at the broad spectrum. You have the officers that are actually on the ground. I provide training to officers that work any state. They can come to my training and they will receive the information that I provide them. So they have that in their toolbox. Because I've always said that the most important tool that a law enforcement officer has, it's not their bulletproof vest, it's not their gun or any less lethal weaponry that they may have. It's what's between their ears. And it's the stuff that you can glean from that training that can impact the decisions that you make out in the field and using better judgment. But then you also have to educate the police managers, the executives. They need to have a better grasp and understanding of what is required to be able to realistically expect a positive outcome in these highly critical, highly stressful tactical scenarios.
That's kind of where I'm thinking of this, because you said there's over 18,000 agencies out there, and then we go back to your stat of high school versus 4-year college education. And to me, by the time you're getting to them, you're really dealing with more of the reaction phase than being the proactive phase. You're more like, okay, we have all these issues in an agency, and here are some solutions or some best practices to follow and to help you. But I feel like we're already we're on the end point, which is great that we're at least doing something. For me, at least what I'm thinking is, how do you get to the start point? How do we get it to where we can change some of these, as you said, the cosmetologist 1,500 hours versus the police officer 800 hours? How do we change these laws? How do we get this to change so that at the starting point we have a 4-year degree, we have over 1,500 hours, we have critical thinking, to where a real change is made?
Well, it really starts with funding and convincing those people that have their hands on the purse strings, realizing that it's not about defunding police. It's about actually funding police, and funding police more than we ever historically have. If you look at the countries over in Europe, the Scandinavian countries, they require a 4-year degree to even be hired. So you'll start the process and you'll go through a 3 or 4-year program, university program, while you're continually being evaluated to determine whether you have these identified characteristics that are more likely than not demonstrating that you're going to be successful as a police officer and be able to make best judgments under stress. Because our brains they're not reactive, they're predictive. So it's really about our experiences and our personal lives growing up, and also our experiences on the job. and in how we process the experiences and what we attribute things to. And that's one thing that's a problem with law enforcement in the United States. All too often, we get this them versus us mentality, and we can't think like that. We are an extension of our communities. And yes, we want to have reduce the incidence and fear and crime. But what's really missing there is the equation where we want the community to feel safe, valued, and respected. And that also has to be highly, highly prioritized in what we do as a law enforcement agency. So how do you do that? It shows, it's demonstrated through the empirical evidence that education helps with this ability to have a broader, open mind to handling scenarios that you're going to be confronted with in the field as a police officer in a way that is going to be more likely than not have a favorable outcome. Now, listen, not every case or incident can be favorable. It's not. I'm not sitting here telling you that police officers should be pacifists. There are times when they're going to have to use force or lethal force. Absolutely. That's part of the work that they have to do, unfortunately. But by and large, we need to focus on what can we do to mitigate those circumstances to prevent that from happening. Because just because you can use lethal force doesn't mean you should. And we need to bridge that gap, or we're going to continue to have this void between societal expectations and this perspective that law enforcement is just imposing their authority on the communities that they serve.
Yeah, and I think that unfortunately that gap is widening because of social media, because of what we see, and because of some of our own experiences. I've had my own experiences. I've had both really great experiences with law enforcement and really bad experiences with law enforcement. I have some great friends who are in law enforcement, who are state police and city police. I have family members who are also, and then I've also had experiences where I remember getting pulled over because I didn't have a front plate on my vehicle that I had just purchased, and it was out of auction, so they didn't have the plate holder. And I was trying to speak with the officer, and he was ready to draw on me. And I'm just trying to tell him like, hey, I just got back from an auction, and I remember that moment, and it was really a feeling of powerlessness, a feeling of like I can't even speak with you. Like I'm just trying to have a conversation with another human being and try to help you understand why I'm in this situation. I was 22 years old, I think I was. So I was young, I was like scared, and you know, I think about those moments, and I understand and appreciate it when I hear others have different experiences. And I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole, but my point of saying this is that I know that there's really amazing, great police officers out there because I have them in my family. I have them as friends. I had a really great conversation with one just recently who's looking to retire in the next 2 to 3 years, and part of what he's thinking of is either become captain or retire. And he's talking about the changes he wants to make and how he's changed as a police officer throughout his years and his career. And his father was a police officer, and how different things are, and how great and how much better they are today. So I have this wonderful experience, and then I also have this other side. And I think, we're always going to have that, like you said, we're always going to have these things. But what we want to do is be able to narrow that gap to where we can see that there's good, and there's some mistakes that happen. But with the best practices, we can minimize those mistakes. We can start, like you said, have that critical thinking. So I love the work that you're doing, and I really think that as much help I can give you to do that, and as much help as others can give you to be able to make some of these changes is huge. One of the things that you just spoke about is funding the police more so towards education. And this is going to really help them as well. One of the ways that we as a society can help you with what you're doing, and that in turn helps us, is we can get on your list to pre-order your book, which is going to be coming out in January. That's Thin Ice. We can get on that list, and Jeff will put that in the comments. So if you're watching this video, it'll be in the comments there on how you'll be able to pre-order this book. You'll be able to get this book in March as well. Before we wrap up this show, I want to also pay tribute to you and some of the honors that you received as a police officer. And I think this is important to bring up because of the work that you're doing. The work that you're doing is you're going into different agencies, different police agencies, and you're telling them, hey, you got to change things. And I think part of the credibility that you have when you walk into these agencies is not just that you were an LAPD police officer, but you've also had a Medal of Valor, you've had a police star, and Meritus unit citation. So I think these are also really important to mention here, because not only were you a police officer, but you were a police officer that was highly regarded within your units, within your agency, and your community, and you're coming to bring that presence into their agencies. And I think that that's something that we should all pay tribute to as well.
Right. Yeah, it's very important, and that's why I believe your listeners will find my book quite intriguing, because it's an insider's perspective. I share my personal stories, my professional experiences, my practical insights, and then give my actionable solutions on what I think needs to be done to be successful moving forward in 21st century. And that's my commitment to law enforcement. And yes, it is. It's an uphill battle, absolutely, but it's certainly one worth taking on, because, as my book states, on thin ice. Law enforcement is on thin ice, and if law enforcement doesn't fix it, then the answers are going to be imposed on them. So that's what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, and I hope that you're able to make some changes, because from what we see and from what I've seen and experienced, as I said, I would like to see a change in law enforcement. I would like to see that critical thinking that you're speaking to. I would like to see more empathy, more engagement with our communities, so that it doesn't feel like us against them. And I think that that works both ways. I think it also works for the police officers too, feeling us against them, but to know that, hey, the community's on your side too. Like, we want you to serve and protect us. In fact, we want you to protect us, right? But we want you to do it to where we also feel safe to come up to you and just speak to you. And I
Right.
think that sometimes that's missing. So I really appreciate that work. Before we wrap up, I mean, you were also on winning multiple hockey awards. You played hockey in the athletic divisions for the LAPD. Tell us a little bit about your hockey experiences.
Well, I grew up as a hockey player, and I played at a fairly elite level. I left home when I was 16 to play junior hockey in Canada. I played in the United States Hockey League for the Dubuque Fighting Saints. I earned a Division I college scholarship, and I probably would have had a fairly formidable professional career if not for some injuries. I blew out my left knee twice, and I blew out my shoulder. So I made a decision to ultimately hang it up. But as a police officer, and during my time with the LAPD, I served as a captain of the LAPD hockey team, and we had a quite formidable team. We had a number of Division One former Division One college hockey players. We had Viktor Nechayev. He was the first Russian to play in the NHL, and he was a Russian translator for the department, so he was eligible to play. And we
Wow.
actually won the International Winter Police Games gold medal twice. So that's playing teams from all over the world. So it was a lot of fun.
That's awesome. What a great experience. And just real quick, in terms of that experience, when we bring sports into our workplace and doing these types of things, this is where community involvement. This is where it's like it brings it in. Tell us a little bit about that experience of when you were playing, and the feelings that bringing the families in and having them watch, and how that all felt.
Well, it's building the camaraderie that you have just for being on the job as a police officer, and just having shared common stressful situations and things that you have to deal with. But but more importantly, like, we would do charity hockey games
Yeah,
against like Hollywood celebrities, and we'd raise money for Make a Wish Foundation. These children that are terminally ill, and we were trying to raise money so they can have a final wish. And
mhm,
that's moving when they come into the locker room, and you get to meet these young children that unfortunately, due to illness, their time on earth is short. So that was very rewarding, very
that's
rewarding.
awesome. Yeah, and it reminds us what to be grateful for. It reminds us the work, why we do the work that we're doing. It's to serve the greater good, and that's in any line of work. That's not just at least if you have that philosophy, that is. But that's in any line of work, not just in law enforcement. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. I want to thank you so much for the work that you're doing with law enforcement. You have your work cut out for you. But you have our full support here. Get his book. Make sure you get on the list. It is coming out. Pre-order it in January. It'll be coming out in March. So click on the links in the comments. You'll be able to get on the pre-order list. That's called On Thin Ice. I want to thank Jeff for coming on the show. I want to thank all of you for watching today. This is the Shining Light Video Podcast Show, where I go live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. with amazing guests just like Jeff. Also, if you'd like, there are some opening spots for our Take Action community. We have our monthly mastermind coming up on December 11th. That's every second Wednesday of the month via Zoom at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. You could jump on. This month, we have Angel Mary. She's going to come in, speak about marketing funnels, how you can better get more leads and better serve your community through these different marketing funnels and being able to get your message out there to the world. I want to thank you all for watching today. As always, stay happy and stay healthy. And I guess stay warm. It's that time of year. Happy holidays, everyone. Thanks for watching.